All right, folks. Today we're talking about an essential reading strategy called anticipate. And this specifically works for those occasional problems that look like our number 38 here. All right, we call these vocab-in-context questions. This particular question comes from a CAP-Ed diagnostic test, 2R101, if you were curious. So this is the name of our strategy, anticipate. I know that the name vocab-in-context may look a little scary. The word vocab is not everyone's favorite thing to see. The real key here is the in-context part, because as we're going to see with this question especially and with anticipate, the goal here is not to define the word supply, okay? In fact, if you try to define the word that they ask you about, chances are you will fall into a Joe Bloggs trap, which is no good. Can't have that. Okay, so first thing we want to do, hopefully this is obvious, we need to read that sentence. Line 53, right over here, here's our word supply. Now, this is, the reason why I picked this out is because this is a horrifying, rambling, ancient passage by Thomas Paine from 1776. All right, so it's a little intimidating. All the more reason to practice. So I'll give us a little bit of context here. All right, the world's longest sentence starts right about here. Thus, necessity, like a gravitating power, would soon form our newly arrived emigrants into society, the reciprocal blessings of which would supersede and render the obligations of law and government unnecessary while they remained perfectly just to each other. Okay, pause right there. So the obligations of law and government are unnecessary as long as people remain perfectly just to each other. So if you're nice to one another, you don't need laws to tell you to be nice, so he claims. So I'll jot that down. If people are nice, don't need government, don't need laws. Doesn't that sound real sweet? We keep going, but as nothing but heaven is impregnable to vice, it will unavoidably happen that in proportion as they surmount the first difficulties of emigration, which bound them together in a common cause, they will begin to relax in their duty and attachment to each other. Pause right there. So all of this stuff in green, nothing but heaven is impregnable to vice. As so to say, we all have our weaknesses, we all have our vices, these temptations. People are not nice, basically. It will unavoidably happen that in proportion as they surmount their first difficulties, as soon as something becomes tricky, people will stop being nice to each other. And this remissness will point out the necessity of establishing some form of government to supply the defect of moral virtue. All right, so we all know what this means. The defect of something. A defect is a lack or a problem and a big issue with moral virtue. All right, moral means telling right from wrong. So if we have a defect of moral virtue here, people are not naturally perfect and nice to each other, boo-hoo. All right, that means we're bad people. According to Thomas Paine, we are bad people. And apparently we have a necessity of establishing some form of government to blank the defect of moral virtue. And I say blank instead of supply because the more we hear the word supply, the more we think of modern definitions of the word supply. And that's not going to help us here, all right? Let's remember, this was a long time ago where literally words meant different things than they do now. So we can't trust our background knowledge here. All right, so we're bad, therefore we need government. So here's where that anticipating comes in. When I say anticipate, all I mean is predict a word instead of the word supply in this sentence. I want you to try and come up with a word that you yourself would put in your own word, you would put instead of the word supply. So if we need government because we have bad moral virtue, then I might fill in this blank by saying the necessity of establishing some form of government to compensate for the defect of moral virtue. And that's one example. Obviously, the goal here is to come up with your own word, so yours might look a teeny bit different from mine, but if you're along those lines, making up for the defect of moral virtue, any of those kind of words will work great here. Okay, so that anticipation is done. Now all we need to do is look for an answer choice here in number 38. Notice we haven't really acknowledged these answer choices until now, until after we anticipated. Now we just need to find something close to compensate for. So I think now it's become a little more obvious. Counteract is really the only feasible answer here, the only one that comes close to what we filled in the blank ourselves. Now, looking at our options, this is why I said don't try and define the word supply, because notice when we hear supply nowadays, we think provide, we think equip, right? Like physical supplies. These are not the answer, okay? We cannot fill in our blank with a word like provide or equip. It doesn't make sense to say, point out the necessity of establishing some form of government to equip the defect of moral virtue. It sounds like we're enabling people to be bad when we establish government. That's no good. That's kind of almost the opposite of the meaning of the word here. All right, occupy, I don't really know where that comes from, so we'll leave that alone. In any case, point is, it's a reading comp question. It's about reading comprehension, so do that. In historical passages and in literature passages, words don't mean what they normally mean, and that's why they're asking you about them. So absolutely trust, anticipate, trust your comprehension of the sentence instead of trying to back solve and cram each one of these into the sentence. You're going to end up coming up with 4 different meanings of the sentence and not being 100% sure which is right. Anticipate on vocab and context questions. Good luck, people.